cannot prove here in this live stream or in a book, we can't prove that Jesus rose from the dead, nor can most historians prove anything else that happened in history. But we can offer enough evidence and a good enough case that the most rational position then becomes to say, I think the probability that it actually happened is greater than the probability of these other alternate theories.
I would go a little bit further than that, just saying it the probability is greater, because what you're doing is using abductive reasoning. Abductive reasoning says, let's look at all the data, let's come up with all the explanations, let's see how all the explanations fare. Do they account for all the data? Do they commit any fallacies? Do they lead to ridiculous results? Those are the three criteria that you use to evaluate each one of the different possible explanations. Then you say, which one is the best explanation? And like you're saying, all these secular explanations, they don't handle all the data. Usually they commit multiple fallacies, which I go through in my podcast. And then they also, a lot of the times, lead to ridiculous results. Like the hallucination theory. It leads to a ridiculous result because that's not what hallucinations look like when you actually look at the qualities of it. But I would argue when you actually look at the data and you look at all the explanations and evaluate them all, it's not just that the resurrection does a better job. The resurrection is the only one that accounts for all the data, the only one that doesn't commit fallacies, and one of the only ones that doesn't lead to ridiculous results. And so it's not just that it's better than the others, it's the only one that actually works. Right? Yep. Which is like, that's intense. So I would say, and this is the way I like to phrase it, to disbelieve the resurrection, you have to resign yourself to the evidence. You have to be irrational. You have to believe the less likely conclusion. So if you say, no, I don't want to believe the resurrection, you are deliberately believing a less likely conclusion, which is irrational. You should follow the evidence where it leads.
Yeah, but faith is still required in the end, because at some point, we use the abductive reasoning that you mentioned there, John. At some point, you might say, well, I think that's the best explanation, but do I want to commit to that or not?
Yeah.
And that's where faith...
it requires trust.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's absolutely right. And the example that I like using of that is Doubting Thomas, where all of his friends are telling him, we have all personally seen Jesus. He rose. And Thomas says, nope, I still doubt it. I got to see him for myself. I got to touch him. Yeah. And then Jesus shows up and says, oh, you of little faith. Well, hold on a second. Would it have been a move of blind, irrational faith on his part to believe the resurrection? No. All his friends... He's got a dozen people around him, probably more, all around, because you got the women as well. More than a dozen people around him telling him, we've seen Jesus, he's resurrected. It would actually have been somewhat reasonable of him to believe the resurrection at that point, especially because Jesus had talked about it, had brought it up.
Jesus, it was predicted.
Yeah. Yeah, so in that sense, it would have been reasonable for Thomas to believe, but it would have still been faith. It would have been evidence-based. It would have been logical. It would have been rational, but it still would have been faith because he would have had to put his trust in it. And so Jesus, when he meets him, says, oh, you have little faith, because he didn't take that step. He had good reason to, right? It's not as though it's irrational or illogical or non-evidence-based, but he needed to take that step and actually put his trust in Jesus.